science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and welcome to yet another edition of Architecture Talk. Each episode we try and have a conversation with an engaging thinker to try and advance our understanding and our ways of imagining architecture. Today we are looking backwards. I'm having a conversation with Washington State University Professor Vahid Vahdat, and we are discussing his book on Persian travelogues, Persionate Utopia. And what he describes is a world in which Persian travelers in the 18th, 19th century who traveled to Europe and how they depicted it. All their different imaginings, their different visions, their dissections of typologies, their erotic descriptions, their drawings on poetics and imagination, which really bring out an understanding of what the West, through a mythologized reading, looked like from the Persianate perspective. I hope you enjoy this conversation and you will take this as an opportunity to get hold of the book. Here we go.
So welcome to Architecture Talk, Vahid. So let's start getting into this book of yours, a fascinating book. It's called Occidental Perceptions of European Architecture in 19th Century Persian Travel Diaries. And you have a subtitles there which says Travels in Farangi Space. And I know Farangi as a word. We talk. It was a semi-disparaging word in India. Farangis were, outsiders, foreigners.
They use it in Turkish. In I didn't know that, like Cambodia, they also have the word, and it's stretched all the way to the east. And
foreign also is the same word. Foreigner is the same as Farangi.
Farangi apparently comes from Franks, so it's more like French at the beginning, but now that's what it connotates, the foreigner, right?
Right.
But for the subtitle, actually, somebody suggested this to me. They said, hey, there's this Star Trek characters which I was not familiar with. They're called the Farangis. They have this planet, and these creatures are very capitalistic, and all of their interactions with other beings is based off of this utilitarian narrow approach of profit. Right. And they said, well, why don't you make it travels in Farangi space? And then there is this double meaning, you're traveling in space. And then I thought that's pretty interesting, and that's where that came from.
So it's a Star Trek reference.
It's a Star Trek reference.
Oh my God, I never picked that up. That's amazing.
It is
right.
funny.
And it's fascinating that in Star Trek, they picked up this word.
They picked up
to
the word.
Describe the capitalist pigs. Yeah, I mean.
Yeah. They're these tiny, funny creatures, and it's interesting because they're comical, and it suggests that the whole idea of this morality based off of profit, it should be by nature comical, but somehow we've accepted it as norm.
So you're talking about Occidentalist perceptions of European architecture in the 19th century. So I take it you are in some kind of a dialogue with Orientalist perceptions.
I am, yes.
Of the quote-unquote Orient, right? I mean, you're trying to say the gaze runs both ways. Edward Said taught us a lot about how the gaze runs in this way, which is how the West saw the East in a figure that it wanted to see it as, and by inversion defined itself as opposite to that or other to that, right?
That is true.
So if that's Said's argument about Orientalism, what is the Occidentalist perception? What are you trying to say with this book about the Persian travelers to the West, their diaries and notations about the West. What are you referring to by saying Occidentalist here?
So as you rightly put it, this has been influenced by Said's Orientalism and how he discusses that, in their attempt to identify themselves, Europeans, as the center of rationality and reason, they projected this, their perceptions onto the Orientals as these, mythical beings and mystical creatures, and very poetic and of course unrational, and thereby they created their image of self, and his argument is based off of course, power relationships,
Right.
which this kind of discourse of Orientalism led to, different types of imperialism and colonizing other countries.
Right.
And so that's the reason that he's skeptical, rightly, that whether there is a symmetrical approach on the other side, because the power structure is for him central. Now, I've been a bit maybe reductionist, and I said, hey, what if we don't consider the power relationships, although it's very important, but when we look at, let's say, an Orientalist romanticist painting, de la Croix, the Death of Sarandapal, well, what if we don't think of that power relationship? Are there not stuff that we can look at and learn from? And there is a lot. We can learn about the fantasies of this artist and the collective fantasies of the society that, at the time was. And all of that made me think that, well, in that case, there is, of course, a reverse gaze. And that's, our gaze towards the Europeans. And in this case, the Farangis, the Westerns, the so-called Westerns, this all-encompassing kind of category where we project our fantasies, and it's very similar. It's very erotic sometimes, it's magical, it's mystical. We want to be the center of this narrative, and these people took part in it, and it's part of how we humans think. We have preconceptions and prejudice, and all of that shapes how we understand stuff in this hermeneutic cycle. So it's just very natural.
Well, whether it's natural or not, or it certainly was naturalized in the 19th century, in the colonial economy of the world, when, like you said, the West produced itself as the sort of flagship of modernity and enlightenment. Then it produced its others through this Orientalist gaze. So as you looked at the sort of reversed gaze in that same economy, which is a sort of a colonial economy, right? Whether or not we account for the asymmetry of power. As you looked at this reversed gaze, describe it for us. You said it had elements of eroticism, it has elements of stereotyping and so on. So what did you find in this gaze towards the West, and I suppose particularly to the Western city?
In general terms, this conception of Farangis, there have been colleagues who have written about it, that has evolved. It was very different. Like back in the 7th, 8th centuries, it was Farangis were, considered kind of barbaric and uncivilized, and that was this perception, again, a stereotype and a projection, but that changed gradually until back at the period that I'm looking at. So I don't want to suggest that it's a static image, but at the time that I'm looking at, it's this advanced other that are progressed and sometimes in a self-orientalizing way. Many of these people who describe them create this phenomenological time as if they're a bit ahead of us and in time, and we are like their past, and we need to catch up, and they sometimes took part in that. But yes, they were more disciplined, they were more organized, they were a bit more materialistic, and they depicted this very erotically. You can see some of the there are images of painters like back in 19th century in Qajar court, which they did a lot of Farangi women. They drew these Farangi women, but when you look at the aesthetics of it, they're just, they come from, the whole history of Persian miniature. They're doe-eyed, thick brows, black hair. But, in the case that I've depicted, much more eroticized, weird clothing that, of course, is not Persian nor from anywhere. It's just the imagination of the artist, a lot of nudity. and that's kind of that image of a woman. And the similar thing we can say about architecture, space, spaces that these people describe have features in them that come from their perceptions of what progress means. For example, most of the time they describe buildings as being extremely high. They're multi-floor buildings. That's what it meant for them to be modern. Or they're never, there's no central kind of courtyard the way that they saw back home. Even if it existed, they would just discuss the ones that have large gardens outside, or it's very pastoral. It's all about this gardens and heavens, and everyone is mingling out and drinking wine and having fun. And that's kind of, just to be simplistic and reductionist, that's the image that they produce.
Right. So, I mean, it's like this wonderland, right? I mean, you talk a little bit about that. The nightless cities and sort of places of fantastic imagination. So in that sense, it seems to me, in many ways, what you are describing, the Occidentalist gaze, is quite symmetrical. Not symmetrical, or maybe even mirrored, that they are reflecting back to the West what the West has reflected onto them as part of the Orientalist gaze. Is that what you're saying? There is no misalignment in that gaze?
There is, yes. They're just, I think both of them are part of the same thread. Like, the similarity is that both use the other to generate the image that they want from the self or the future of the self. And there's that utopian aspect to it. But then the utopias are different. The utopian image that these travelers took with them and projected on what they saw and brought back is based off of a whole different history. It's based off of Persian literature. It's based off of Islamic imagery. And in that sense, it might be slightly different, but in that sense, it's exactly what makes both of them very similar.
So describe the Persionate, let's just say, Persionate utopia that's constructed through this Occidentalist gaze.
The book did not directly discuss this utopia as one piece of cohesive idea that informed these peoples, but rather I tried to find signs and clues of what it has been. And therefore it's somewhat fragmented, which probably it should be. It's collage-like. And of course, since it was dynamic and different based off of these people, now, I've studied 4 people, most of them were royalty. I discuss how one of them, which was a student and didn't have the financial means as the others had a very different idea. And I discuss how the servants that came with these people abroad who didn't write, but they seem to have a very different utopia in mind. But the clues that we get here, one of the central things is order. It might be because they had this critical stance towards the state of Iran at the time, right after the Perso-Russia war that ended in 1813. They seem to be, that's what they lacked. And that's the thing that they talk about, everywhere. They see order in everything. They exaggerate it and they talk about it constantly. Their utopia at the same time seems to be very influenced by this military background of the war. Like, for example, they're extremely interested in military typologies. They describe barricades and castles a lot, and they're heavily invested in describing how thick the walls are, and if it's thicker, it's better, and they talk about it constantly, especially at the beginning of these travels. So I was hoping that I would, maybe be able to discover this fantasy, what it is in its totality, but all I got was these different, sometimes contradicting clues. It's not that it didn't change throughout their travels. In many ways, they stuck with their image, but sometimes they were, they kind of modified it to fit their actual observations.
So these 4 guys, Abul Hassan, Mirza Saleh, Raza Qoli, and Farooq Khan, upperclassmen. So why were they traveling there?
So that's a good question. They had different reasons. So based off of their timeline, Abul Hassan Ilchi, he was an ambassador, and he had a mission that drove him to England, and he had to stay a bit longer. And there were other, smaller missions that he, attended to. That was his kind of reason. Reza Quli and his two brothers, they flew Iran after the death of the previous king. They were potential successors, and their father was captured. So they flew to England trying to seek refuge and also maybe negotiate their father's release, which passed away anyway. So they were there involuntarily, and at least Reza Quli was never able to go back. They were not exiles. Mirza Saleh was a student. He was sent as part of a group of 5-6 other students who came to England to study, and it was the second group of students that were sent by Iran to go to study abroad. So that was his thing, and so his conduct was very different, especially since he had this very scientifically minded. He didn't attend these parties that were frequent back then, and he was constantly trying to learn different stuff. He would work voluntarily in different sectors to just learn these different crafts. So his experience is very different. Farrokh Khan was also on a mission, a diplomatic mission. He was the foreign minister. He went to see Napoleon III and the Treaty of Herat with England. So there is a bit of difference with why they were there.
You have a chapter called Imagining the Modern, right?
Right.
So this is the different from the sort of utopian. Well, it's semi-connected to the utopian. And you have fantastic titles for this. Mapping Modernity, A Kache Bagh to Progress, Refashioning the Farangi House, Rediscovering Aram, Reflecting a Different Sky, The Kingly Palace, The Bridal Chamber, The Nightless City, Space That Belongs to Nobody, Touching the Milky Way, Constructing the Magical Aesthetics of Rationality, Spatial Lacunae. These are amazing titles. This could be a great music album. Titles like Touching the Milky Way, Space That Belongs to Nobody, The Nightless City, right?
Right.
What are you trying to get to with all these titles here? And what is the sort of word picture you're trying to paint here?
So just to make sure that I understand your question, I'm going to respond it in two different ways. So the titles are kind of poetic because they come directly from the travel diaries. And the travel diaries, they used language. It's, first of all, there is a history of travel writing genre in Iran called safarname. So it does come
means travel, right?
Travel, exactly. So it comes from this kind of, and there is this kind of genre in Arabic. I think it's called rihla here. We call it safarname. And so they have read similar stuff, and they know how they can contribute to this genre, where they depict themselves as the center of the world that they're narrating. They depict all the wonders. If nothing goes on, they don't talk about it. They exaggerate in the things they see. And of course, they take advantage of the vast literature, the poetic literature, to expand on their observations. So for example, I think Reza Quli, Mirza, all of them, except for Mirza Saleh, their tone is extremely poetic, and they exaggerate. It's full of metaphors, rhymes, semi-rhymes. And
why is that? Why is that? Why are they writing in a poetic form rather than a simple narrative form?
At least for me, the question was in reverse. Why is it that this one person is writing in a very different tone? Mirza Saleh, the student. And it seems that he was told by the minister, a very strong figure himself and a very important figure in Persian literature, that, hey, just write very simple, just explain stuff. And he talks about that. He says, hey, I've been advised to just give you everything in the plain way. And it seemed very different from the type of literature that we read, not only travel literature, but most literature at the time. Authorship meant, showing your strengths in bringing all these ideas together and using the whole poetic background that you have. They cite so many poems, it's just insane. Some of them, like Reza Quli Mirza cites, I think about 30 different poets, some of them that I didn't even know. And he does, his book is full of those. So it brings, it somehow, I am assuming that part of the utopia that they're trying to depict comes from that the whole poetic heritage that they've been exposed to. So
okay, but to return to the question of the titles,
So if the question is not really about why are these titles poetic, but and about the content more so, then the response would be because. So I explain here that no, we need to understand that these travelers are not architects, and architecture is not their main focus, and it's just the background of their description. And it's a very important background, and many times it becomes the major way that they evaluate the progress they see in Farangestan or the West, but it's not the center of discussion, and therefore it's very fragmented, and I try to capture that fragment. So you would see they discuss, suddenly there's a lot of discussion about streets and roads and how wide and paved they are and how straight they are and they don't bend, and there's suddenly so much descriptions of landscapes, gardens, large gardens. They depict London, 19th century London, in all of its density and pollution and population, all the things that we know, as if it's just this amazingly large garden, right? So some things become really more discussed, and those are the ones that I captured, and therefore I kind of kept it kind of fragmented, didn't try to catalog them into some sort of compartmentalization that is supposedly giving us an hierarchical and polished understanding. So I kept these items based off of how they described it.
What were their critiques of the city? What were they critical of?
They were critical of a lot of things. Like some of these people, depending on their characters, like Ilchi was never satisfied. He was critical of. He didn't like the horses. He didn't like what people ate in Europe. They didn't like how they cook, the furnishing of the room that he was offered. He was critical of a lot of things. Paintings, he didn't like them. Why would people pay so much for painting? They don't look good. And he had no concern in conveying it to people he met. But the interesting thing is, none of that little of that exists in the travel diaries. I had to find that out in other sources. So, which is pretty crazy. So, for example, Reza Ghali and his brothers, they talk about London, again, 19th century London, industrial city. They say how they love the weather there, and how the water. They especially talk about how the water is so fresh and cold and nice, and they depict the city as this large garden, right? But then I read Fraser, who was their companion, in his daily diaries, and apparently these guys they hated London so much that they were asking for any possibility to get out of London to some of the countrysides, and they physically got sick. And later on, I read that in his discussion with the Prince of Austria, they particularly said that they don't like the water there. They complained to Fraser, who wrote, in kind of transliterated. They said, we're sick of the jeer and beer of the cars, the carts and carriages that roam London. It was too much. They didn't like the overpopulatedness, but they don't mention that.
So these are not journals kept by people for personal use. These are sort of diaries intended to be published or sent to people. Yes?
All of them were intended to be published. Some of them most of them didn't get published or found a vast readership in Iran. But some of them...
So they were catering to a market, therefore?
They were catering to a market, and part of the market was the royalty. These were widely read. They were erotic, they were fun to read, and they talked about these wonderlands. Nasir ad-Din Shah, the king, asked Farrokh Khan to write his diaries because he wanted to read them. It was part of his mission. You need to keep your diary, right? Yeah. And so they were widely read by the court. But even though some of them were not published in Iran until lately, they were intended to be published. Reza Ghali Mirza's book, the translation was published right away, even before he went back to Iraq, and the translation was vastly read in England. So
I
they
see.
were catering to, this audience, especially the royalty, who were looking at this to kind of reverse engineer the progress that they saw in Europe.
Why was erotics a sort of an element in them? What was that about?
Well, first of all, they're all men. None of them are women, and they eroticize, of course, their depiction of women and interactions between men and women. Muhammad Tawakkul Taraki has a full chapter about eroticizing women in travel diaries. Now, and I assume that part of it comes from these. He discusses that this is part of the larger image of this heavenly image that they create of Farang, and therefore Farangi women become the equivalent of the heavenly huris, these maidens that roam in heavens, supposedly with the blessed, right? So it might be this. It might be that it's part of the the literature, the Persian poetic literature that has a very thick erotic and sometimes pornographic parts to it. But for me, what was interesting was the spatial equivalent of this eroticism. Like, what does that mean space-wise? And part of what it meant was they would explain spaces as if there is no border between private and public spaces, even inside, residences. If somebody reads these books and base their image of Europe based off of this, they would think that there is absolutely no borders. Unlike the common architecture of central Iran, the hot and arid regions where most of the buildings are facing inward towards the central garden, there's no windows looking outward to the streets, especially in cities that these folks come from, Kashan, Shiraz. The Farangi cities are, they provide windows to outside, and of course from outside you can have a gaze inward, and this private zones, Andaruni, Biruni, where we have this dichotomous diagram of residences in Iran, where we have one part is totally Andaruni and all of the and the one part is Biruni, where
Andaruni means inward looking,
and it's for the family, but Biruni is where you can have guests, and that's where they stop. They cannot go further inside, and that doesn't exist, and nothing for them that suggests any kind of division between men and women exists. But the interesting thing for me was, while they totally collapse any kind of distinction of spaces based off of gender, when it comes to socioeconomic classes, they do the reverse. They're very fast to pick up on any signs that lower classes, they cannot mingle easily with the upper classes. They are so good in picking these hierarchies and reflecting them in their diaries. So as much as they seek to a utopian place where this mingling between genders was free, they did not have the same vision for classes, especially since they were upper class royalty.
Right. What I'm hearing you say is that these diaries saw this breakdown of inward-looking and outward-looking privacy-based spaces as indexed to access to women. That was in the direction of progress and utopia or something amazing. Is that right? And they were not critical of it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it was fantastical. Part of it is exactly what you're saying. And I think part of it is, again, the readership. You have the royalty back home who are waiting to get your book. And this is one of the things that they're going to look at. Yeah.
Whatever it is, whether
they're
it's
going to look for
audience
that.
or fact.
Exactly.
This was all seen as wonderful.
It was part of the wonder. Now, again, it's a bit different. So, for example, Mirza Saleh absolutely does not take part in that. In fact, he always has this distant, objective kind of view to everything. He has access to these moments that he could have gone and used the same logic that the others do and write, lengthy stuff about what he sees. For example, he saw there was a painting class when people were painting this nude model. He does not describe it much. It's just like very indifferent to him. It's just a paragraph, short one. Or he sees these pools where they were, not gender divided, and he wanted to present this objective view, and therefore, I don't want to generalize it. I've studied only 4 people, but at least 3 of them, that's what you see very dominant in their writings.
I mean, that's fascinating because that's sort of therefore a 19th century Occidentalist Persianate perception of the West.
Right.
It runs contrary to sort of the Orientalist perception, the Western perception of, let's say, Persia or India, as imagining the Persianate gaze on the West as thinking of open spaces and the women as licentious, and the inverse of the highly protected Eastern woman. So in that sense, it's in some ways more already westernized than the Orientalist gaze would think it to be, or even what some contemporary forces in Persia, in Iran, in the East in general might think of themselves as. What are your thoughts on that?
I totally agree, and it's quite surprising and a little bit counterintuitive to hear this, and I'm assuming that later this might have happened. I have seen literature that suggests that the gaze by these people were divided, what they saw between materialistic manifestations of European culture and then the spiritual one, and there was this divide, and as open as they might have been to technologies and material accomplishments that they saw in Europe, they were not as open to the worldview that they saw. But that was really not the case, and it was not the case because they had no clue of what's going on. In fact, these people, when you read them, they have a very strong understanding of concepts such as freedom, democracy, and the rule of law, and they do mention it in cases, but they were very optimistic and open. At least these people were. And then they create a discourse, right? And that discourse creates counter discourses that also, instead of being critical of modernity in Europe, they were critical of what these folks brought back, and therefore they engage in a counter discourse that is also very based off of, it's based off of local imaginations.
Perhaps it's useful to talk about the cover image that you have used. It's from one of the travel diaries, and it shows a multi-story pavilion that has at least 4 stories, and then it shows a garden which is enclosed in a fence with some trees, animals. And then it has what appears to me to be a hot air balloon, right, sort of rising above the clouds with 3 people in it.
Well, this is not from the diaries. I created this, so this is total fiction.
You created this collage?
Yes.
What's going on? Why did you make that?
So what this is doing is kind of based off of some of these images that you may see in the book. Now, I know that, your audience don't have access to videos, but I'm going to show you an example here of these 2 drawings, which you would see in my background. This, one of them is a painting by Nasir ad-Din Shah, the king of Iran and the first king to travel to Europe in the 19th century. And this is his painting. He did watercolors, and it was okay. And this is what he drew of Farangestan. And then this is a miniature, and I think it's back in 16th or 15th century in Ali Qapu in Iran, in Isfahan, on a wall, a fresco. And you could see that here the content is quite astonishingly the same. It's this woman, and the man, and they're inside this vast landscape, and the woman is providing wine to the man, and there is water and a tree, and they're under a tree, and it's very pastoral and based off of this utopian imagination. But here, of course, the form has changed now to kind of follow a bit of painting conventions at the time in Europe, but the content is the same. But the background, you see this architecture, and again, it has all these items that we talk about. It's multi-story, it's symmetrical, it's hierarchical, it has a center that is strong. It's elevated based on these, stairs that we see. and it's got this order to it. You see the rhythm of the modules of the window and all of that, and plus, you see the somewhat erotic nature of both the image and the architecture. So this is kind of what inspired me to kind of go this route. And I have another image of the book in the book that kind of does the same, by Nasruddin Shah, and I kind of use that to explain how whatever they saw, it was filtered through their preconceptions, and there is no escape from that, at least for these, and part of it is very unconsciously happening, part of it is very conscious and intentional, and they contribute to this image. And especially even if it was, the most objective depiction, it would definitely, be skewed through in translation. The readership who has not seen these, based off of the vocabulary and based off of what they read, they would still have very native imagination of what this architecture would look like.
But I'm intrigued by what this tells me about your imagination, because
Right.
you made this, right?
I made this. And that's a good point. And I'm, and I explain in the book that, I'm similar. I find myself very similar to these travelers. And I constantly ask myself.
You and I are travelers. Right?
We're travelers.
We are travelers in Farangestan.
We're travelers in Farangestan. And I wrote stuff for my readership. And I was, of course, wanted to excite them. And I see that most of my writings were exactly the same as these guys were the moment I came here, rather than later that I had more experience. And so these people, most of the time you would see that they had this idea and they would just give it all away on their first day. Aminuddoleh had a short stop. He's traveling on the sea. He starts from, I think, Istanbul. He has a short stop in Naples. And on that one-day visit, he proclaims that he knows about the Farangi architecture. That's his kind of wording, as if there is such a thing, and he talks about it to us without even seeing much, right? So, and I constantly, thought of myself through this research that maybe I also have expectations and desires and fantasies, and I'm projecting on my subjects, which are these travelers, and I'm taking part in creating a story, rather than generating an objective account of these travels. It does show kind of how I see these travels and how they take part in creating an Iranian modernity.
Do you bring discussions about the inevitability of cultural bias in perception into your studios?
I do bring in a lot of utopian speculations in my studios, and that always brings in discussions of perception one way or another. For example, it's sometimes disheartening when you see a group of bright students that you have, how limited their perceptions of an ideal society is, and how the normalcy of our capitalist way of life seems unavoidable to them, and they don't seem to think that there can be an alternative. Many times it's like whatever you see, they're very satisfied with the suburban American
Right.
towns. The only thing that they would probably add is a couple of solar panels on top of it, and voila, this is the best that we can do.
Yeah.
Which is very frightening, and it's a subject of my studios.
How are you teaching this material that we talked about and you wrote about in your book? Like, how do you account for this in your own teaching and learning as a scholar and faculty teaching at Washington State University today?
As you said, I'm not using it directly at this point, but I bring it in multiple indirect versions. When I'm teaching histories and surveys, I am interested and I focus on, this transfer of knowledge between different cultures and how that generates a network through which we can have a better understanding of where we are and how we got here. But second, it's those methodic values that it has, that, hey, let's accept that it would change the way we encounter students and think about courses, the ways in which our preconceptions form the way we approach new knowledge. and filter it and are resistant to new ideas. And all of that is, fascinating and valid, right? For students who may not have seen alternative to their smaller societies in which they've been raised. They may not be able to imagine, let alone accept, alternative forms of architectural and urban settings. That's one part of it. The other part, as I said, is my interest in utopian speculations, that maybe facing the crises, the multiple types of crises, ecological crises that we're facing, this piecemeal approach of let's make things a tiny bit better through solar panels and quantification of lead mentality may not help us, and maybe we need to go back to some of our roots in reimagining and having some sort of we know that utopian thinking has in many cases been disastrous, and and many have argued for that, and Popper, for example, is but at this point I think we've learned some of our lessons, and we need to have some sort of a normative agenda that is based off of ethical values rather than just utilitarian,
just a reaction to
exactly.
But as we move towards the end here, I want to press this point a little bit more, because it's a question I think about myself a lot, because since I'm from India and I teach here in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle, the question of my biography is always in, or rather my question is always how is it at play in whatever I do here, right? In your travelers, the question of their biography is always at play, and you foregrounded that. And certainly when Western travelers were traveling in Persia and India, their biography was certainly at play. So our biographies have also all inevitably have to be in play.
That's true.
And certainly you're from Iran, I'm from India, Iran's in the news every day.
That's true.
Here in the United States. So how do you negotiate that, or do you negotiate?
I just want to see your perspective on this. And I don't want to be a politician, but you've been here longer and you've had to face the same issues. And and I can see based off of the discussion that this has been something that you've been thinking about, and many of the material that I'm saying resonates to you, because really nothing spectacularly different about the way these travelers process information and use their agency to bring back ideas to their country. What would your thoughts be on this? Like, do you think that there needs to be ways of bringing this to the foreground in classes, presenting it as case studies? Is it more methodic and you use this background information about perceptions and utopia into studio? Or
I find it works in two ways. Sometimes I feel like I am asked to be the guy from India, to perform that role even if I don't want to, or if I have to be the exotic or native informant or the representative citizen, teach courses on India and talk about that.
Wow.
Other times it seems to me I have to do the opposite. I have to sort of not be Indian, but to identify in what ways I am rigorously acceded to the Western way of thinking, or whatever the Seattle way of doing things, so that I can show that although I'm from India, I can speak Derrida and Corbusier better than anybody else over here. And that kind of dynamic, I find at play in what you're describing. More and more, I feel like there is no not having it at play. And it is certainly at play when I'm sort of dissimulating it and just being a scholar, in the Western sense, right? Or a practicing architecture or a designer of Western modernism. So I feel I've played these two roles for a long time. And in playing those two roles, I have, essentially fallen prey to the Orientalist, Occidentalist continuing regimen, right?
And is this also encouraged by our discipline? I mean, if you were a computer scientist, would you have that problem as much?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, all these computer scientists I see all over Seattle all the time, they play white Western technicians, and then they present themselves as culturalists. I mean, they have the Hindu festivals or Indian festivals. I think it's always at play, but certainly at play more in the humanities and our disciplines.
I've always found human contradictions. It's always fascinating to me. Like, some things are clearly not right, and you would do them anyway. And this is, I think, it's a human capability to be full of contradictions.
Absolutely.
And this is maybe why I was fascinated with the travel accounts, because I was not interested in objective discussions of what, and travel accounts, given that they're written daily, they're full of contradictions. They're not curated for a coherent narrative at the end. They're just fragments. This person is upset today. Their representation of what they see is very different and contradicts their couple of next pages. And maybe I've justified that for myself because I feel I'm really fine and comfortable in this mental place that you're describing. And maybe it is because of the fascination in these contradictions.
Yeah, it is a contradiction. And we inhabit this contradiction. In that sense, I would say, we're not that different from these travelers.
We're not that different from these travelers. It's funny that these travelers have become important and other people are studying them. But many times I see that they treat them as if they're these backward people and they're funny in their encounters with these modern technologies. And that's not how I see, a group of very intelligent people with different agendas and different ambitions and mischiefs as well. But I can totally relate, and I think, and then again, as I said early in this discussion, and you kind of picked it out from my discussion, I see it a bit natural. That this is the way that you understand stuff. You have prejudice, and you take part in this hermeneutic cycle, and you build upon it, and that's what they did. That's what we'll do, and that's what generations later who would listen to your podcast would do.
Will say about us. Do you get your students to make their versions of collages of Isfahan or
well, you've been at my reviews, you've seen some of the type of work.
Well, that was very different. Yeah,
that was very different. That's no, they don't. No, I don't. I don't do that. I do bring in especially I do bring in tectonics in discussions, like especially when it's about construction and these fascinating details that I can bring in and they're relevant today. But no, I don't do that. I should try maybe.
I think that would be interesting.
Yeah,
and I'll try it too, and then maybe we can share reviews.
We should do that.
Vahid, it has been such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for being on Architecture Talk.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. Appreciate this.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.